Good morning. How are you doing? Well, it's an honor to be here with you talking about the mind and its potential. And what an honor to follow up these two fantastic speakers who introduced you to thinking about the mind and the brain and questions about how we understand the difference between those two. So to expand the view of mind and its potential and what's the connection between the mind and the brain, I'm going to take us one more step into the idea that we can think of not only the mind and the brain, but the mind, the brain, and relationships. So we'll be looking at how social connections, our relationships, and the emotions that come with them influence how we learn, influence how we live, and influence, in fact, how we can be making this world a more compassionate and kinder place in which to live. So it's a stretch to go from these incredible slides of neurosurgery and thinking about the details of the brain to thinking about relationships, but let me try to offer you a way to think about that. First of all, if you think about a relationship, what comes to your mind about what that is? What is a relationship? One you might have, let's say, with a friend or a partner, a child, if you're a teacher with a student, if you're a therapist with your client, with your patient. What is a relationship really? And how can we talk about a relationship and the brain in one talk, and especially even in one sentence? How can we do that? Because the first time I ever did that, the person who heard that, who got most upset, came to me and said, "I think you're out of your mind to actually put in relationships and neural functioning in the same slide in this case." And then it was an entire talk about that connection. So the field of interpersonal neurobiology that you heard mentioned is actually a field where we try to bring together everything you might want to know about relationships. So looking at culture, looking at history, looking at sociology, looking at the way we've functioned as a human family over thousands and thousands of years, all the way to new findings in how neurons communicate with each other, how they connect to each other in the synapses you've heard about, and how they differentiate and form different layers of the skull-based part of the nervous system we call the brain. So how can you actually tie those together? How can you tie culture with synaptic connections? How can we do that? Well, in interpersonal neurobiology, we do that by actually inviting all the sciences that study those fields into the same perspective. And we do that by then looking at what connects relationships within families and cultures to synaptic connections. And if you think about it for a moment, what would that connection be? I don't know either, so it's the end of my talk. Thank you. So there is actually a way to do this. And just so you have the background, I'm going to be giving you the take-home messages because this is a very short talk. But just so you have where to get the background science, there's a series of books I've edited. 15 books are now published in the field of interpersonal neurobiology, and you get that from www.norton.com, which is a publisher in New York. And this is a series for professionals, especially for clinicians, where we look head-on into this issue of how is the social brain shaping our lives with each other in various ways, whether it has to do with trauma or child development or whatever. You'll find those 15 textbooks for professionals there. You'll also find 2 research centers that I help run at UCLA. One is the Center for Culture, Brain, and Development, which you'll find at cbd.ucla.edu. And there you'll see we have undergraduates, graduate students, and postdoc students who are doing their work in looking exactly at this issue. How do cultural factors influence synaptic connections? And so we have brain mapping and anthropology and linguistics and education and psychology and psychiatry all working together to form an interdisciplinary research center. And you'll find our work. We've been doing this for about 8 years now. And then there's the Mindful Awareness Research Center, where we actually look at how does the focus of attention using mindful awareness actually change the function and structure of the brain. Because when we look at these three things together, relationships, mind, and brain, they're not the same, but they influence one another. So when you think about Susan Greenfield's excellent talk and look at that slide about mental practice leading to changes in the brain attributed to the fingers of just imagining playing scales, coming out pretty much the same as if you actually played the scales, you can see that imagining playing scales is an act of mental action. It's a focus of attention. So now we know, without really a doubt, even though some people may be puzzled by it, that mental activity can change the physical structure of the brain. And the study of mindful awareness, which we look at in the Mindful Awareness Research Center at UCLA, the focus of attention, if trained in a certain way, can alter the connections in the brain and change its physical structure. We also know that relationships between a parent and a child can alter the way the mind develops in ways we believe very strongly affect the development of the brain, and that's what our interpersonal neurobiology series is about. So what is this connection between relationships and the brain, and what in the world is the mind? We've heard earlier that we've got the notion of a personalized manifestation of the unique neural configurations as one way of thinking about the mind. But what is the mind? What is the brain? And what are relationships? This is what I would like you to think about. And if you're thinking about this, you can think about a triangle which has these 3 points: brain, mind, and relationships, that form a triangle that can organize an entire way of thinking about our development, about our society, about what you do in therapy, about what you might do in schools. Mind, brain, and relationships are 3 fundamental parts of something that we're going to need to explore, and hopefully by the end of this talk, we'll be able to define what that is. So let's go to the first slide and start actually with the easiest of those 3 points, which amazingly is the brain. And you've heard 2 wonderful talks just now about the details of this brain. So I'm just going to briefly summarize some of the issues that we've already heard. You know that there's a basic cell in this brain called the neuron. It's actually supported, it's 100 billion neurons in there, in the skull-based part of the brain, supported by glial cells, which are in the trillions. And those supportive cells help alter blood supply to areas of the brain and also help create the myelin sheath, which is basically helps the conduction down neuronal circuits be much faster, much, much faster. And that's how we actually create skills in our lives. This brain has an anatomy to it that you heard can be described in this triune way, Paul MacLean's view. And you know there's a deeper part that develops early in life. The limbic area then develops a little later in utero. And then when the baby's born, the higher part of the brain you've heard about, the cortex, is open to development, continually shaped by genetics, but also shaped by experience. So the first take-home lesson I want to give to you is that whenever you hear the word experience, what we believe it means is firing in the brain, that is electrical flow down the long axonal length and the release of neurotransmitters at the end. That's what we mean by neural firing. So the first thing is that whenever you think of the word experience, whether it's playing the piano or imagining playing the piano, those are experiences. And experience gets neurons to fire. That's point number 1. Point number 2 as a take-home message is that when neurons fire, they wire together. So in other words, if I see a dog and the dog bites me, I'm going to have an association between the perception of the dog and the pain of the bite and the fear of the dog. Those will become associated with each other, and if I have another experience with a dog where the dog bites me, that will reinforce that learning. So learning is the association of neuronal firing. So if we learn a fact or have a self-experience that's unique to us, like I've been bitten by a dog, that is associated with stronger connections among neurons. Skills include not only the synaptic connections, but the laying down of myelin sheath, so that if you become a piano player or a tennis player or learn to play chess or even develop the skill of compassion, I'll have you think about in terms of training your mind, training involves myelin. So you not only make synaptic connections with learning, but now with practice, you're putting this coiled sheath of myelin, which is white. So this is the white matter of the brain, whereas the gray matter are the nuclei of the neurons. So the white matter are these long axonal lengths when they have myelin on them. And with myelin, you're increasing the speed 100 times, and the resting period between firing, when a neuron needs to rest, is actually decreased by 30 times. So 30 times 100, if you lay down myelin, you are 3,000 times as effective as if you were a circuit without myelin. So when you see gymnasts, for example, do the amazing things they do, they have circuits that are 3,000 times faster than those of us who don't have myelinated gymnastic circuits. So how you wire the brain together determines overall how its activity will be. So the brain is this incredibly wonderful, yet mysterious in many ways, organ of the body, and it's not only allowing us to do gymnastics and play tennis, but it is the social organ of the body. So we haven't heard much about that yet today, so I want to really focus on that. The brain is the social organ of the body, and we've evolved over millions of years, hundreds of millions of years as mammals, and then in our more human-like form for probably 4.4 million years, and certainly in our very human form for at least 40,000 years. And we have this brain that has allowed us to survive because we have relationships with each other. We don't have big claws. We don't have big fangs. We're not that strong. We're kind of weird and walk around in a very strange ways. But how did we survive? We survived because we could look at another human being and figure out what is going on with them. So in hunting terms, if we're being very quiet and hunting a mammoth, we look at the face of our peers and we figure out the mammoth isn't there yet. Oh, the mammoth is there now. Go, shh, go. And so we have a whole set of circuitry devoted to looking at a face and knowing what's going on inside of that person. And clearly, we're profoundly social. Look at all of us sitting here. Think about how much time we spend with one another in face-to-face interactions. And this is why, in terms of the science of learning, learning is a profoundly social experience. Just throwing something up on the internet and these sound bites that we've heard about doesn't make for deep learning. A relationship over our evolution has been the essential way in which we've taught young to become the more mature members of our village, of our societies. And yet, we're losing that face-to-face contact, so it's just something to think about. Now, let's go from then the brain, which we now have just a feeling of just the architecture of it, to asking the question, well, then, what is a relationship? And how does this guy, Dan, say, why does he say the brain is the social organ of the body? What does that really mean, social organ of the body? What does that mean? Well, here's an idea. What's happening between me and you right now? I'm sending something to you, and you're receiving something that you can then respond to, and I'm actually looking at your faces. So I'm taking something from you, and then it's affecting me, and then I'm going to send something back to you. What is that something that we share in a relationship? What's that? Information, that's right. So there's information. So if I said to you, the Sydney Opera House, does that sound wave of molecules moving in the air have information for you? Sure, right? Sydney Opera House. Can anyone picture the Sydney Opera House in your mind? You experience it? Only 3 people. Wow, everyone else is sleeping. This is not good for my feeling of personal identity or something. Okay, so the Sydney Opera House appears in your mind. How did that happen? How in the world did that happen? If we can answer that question, then we've done our job this morning. How did that happen? So let's walk it through. I say Sydney Opera House. Right? Now, what just happened? All that happened is I have the intention in my mind, which we'll define very soon. I get my brain to fire in a certain way, which is totally wacky from what most scientists will say, but my mind gets my brain to do something, and the brain then sends electrical signals down to my vocal cords, which, combined with my breathing with my lungs, sends air out through my vocal cords and shakes the air, so I say Sydney Opera House, right? I don't say Golden Gate Bridge or polar bears. I said Sydney Opera House, right? So the air is moving in a certain frequency. That's energy being transmitted through changes in molecular, basically, density of the air. That's what the motion of the air molecules is. You have a tympanic membrane, an eardrum, which is now going to be affected by what? By the vibration, by the energy that's called sound, exactly. So just in this little bit, we have energy flow. The motion of molecules is kinetic energy of air molecules that's now hitting your tympanic membrane, your eardrum, and it's moving with energy, right? The tympanic membrane, and that's attached to all sorts of bones, which are attached to nerves, which send a frequency signal down your ear nerve, your acoustic nerve, which then goes into your brain, goes to certain areas of your brain. And if I said a word like glikanara, anybody get anything from that? No. So I could say a sound that anyone speak Greek? Not many Greek speakers. Okay. Well, if you spoke Greek, you would have a connection just like you had with Sydney Opera House, although it would be for sweet water, right? But for those of you who don't speak Greek, it has no information in it. It's just energy. So there's a transfer of energy from me to you with glikanara. You can't get the information from that because it has no meaning for you. As someone mentioned in the audience, you don't have a memory of Greek language, or you were never on the incredible nudist colony on the southern coast of Crete that I was at called Glikanara, where you live in caves and have all sorts of wonderful experience when you're 25 years old. Anyone remember that beach? You probably have your own in Australia. So we do wonderful things when we're 25. So that's what Glikanara means for me. In many parts of my body, it means a lot. So you don't have that experience. Well, you have your own Glikanara. It's your personalized experience there. So the point is that Sydney Opera House has this information in it. So relationships are the sharing of energy and information flow. That's what a relationship is. The brain is the mechanism of the flow. And a long time ago, in the beginning of the decade of the brain, I ran a scientific interdisciplinary group of 40 scientists. Our job was to say, what's the connection between mind and brain? And the group was about to implode because no one could decide what the mind was. The brain was very easy. Even though we don't really know how it works, it's easy to define what it is. A bunch of neurons in the skull. Really complex, fascinating, a mystery, but definable. What's the mind? What's the mind? Well, you'd be amazed to find a number of philosophers say you shouldn't define the mind. It's an error. A number of friends of mine who are very smart scientists tell me you should not define the mind. But I'm going to give you a definition, not knowing that there were these errors that were made by making a definition, that I gave to this group to keep it alive. And we stayed together for 4 years, 40 scientists, and 100% of the people in the room agreed with this definition. And it's changed my entire approach to psychotherapy, to education, to conceptual thinking for interpersonal neurobiology. And here it is. The mind is an embodied and relational process that regulates the flow of energy and information. The mind is an embodied process. It's not just in the skull. It's at least distributed throughout the nervous system that extends throughout the whole body, number one. Number two, it's not just in a single skull or a single body. It's relational, like is happening now in the sharing of energy and information that's happening between me and you. So we have the sharing as relationships. The mechanism that structures that flow of energy and information is the nervous system, which we'll just call the brain for now. And the mind is the regulatory process. Now, when you regulate a car, what do? You have to see what's going on, and you have to shape it. You have to do these two things. You have to monitor and modify. So what I'm telling you is that by taking the bold and perhaps big error step from philosophy and science, they say it's an error, but we're going to do it anyway, and say you can define the mind as a regulatory process that's embodied and relational, and it regulates the flow of energy and information. It means you can teach people in schools and teach people in therapy to build a stronger mind by increasing the capacity to monitor energy and information flow and to then modify it. So if we go to the next slide, let me give you an example of what happens when you tune into the mind of another person in a relationship between a parent and a child. The first 8 of these 9 functions that emerge from the middle prefrontal area, just behind your forehead, are proven outcomes of what loving, attuned, secure attachment between a parent and a child allow the child to develop. The first 8 have been studied. The last 9, intuition, has just not been studied yet. Mindfulness meditation promotes and is composed of all 9 of these functions. So I'm going to review for you what they are. This list comes from me taking care of a patient and her mother. And the mother, unfortunately, had a terrible car accident. And she wasn't wearing her safety belt. And the steering wheel struck her forehead just above her eyes. And unfortunately crushed the area there, which you saw on the prior slide is called the prefrontal cortex, and in this case, the middle part of it. I took her neurosurgeon's slides to the library. I'm a psychiatrist, so I'm taking care of the whole family, a child psychiatrist. And I went to the library and found initially many of these, and later the list got a little longer, but this mom had lost all 9 of these functions in any kind of reliable way. And I had seen a video of her before the accident, and her daughter, who was 7, had stopped speaking. And the daughter brought in this video of her mom before the accident. There was this loving, attuned mother. And when Leanne, this young girl, had experienced her mom before, when she was 5 years of age, she was developing beautifully. She herself was developing these incredible functions of being able to regulate her body, because this prefrontal area, if you put your hand below, the Institute has given you a special model of the brain. So if you reach beneath your seat, it's taped underneath your seat. Just reach under your seat and you can pull out the model. It's really there. Try it. No one believes me. They've seen me do this before. If you reach under your hand, if you put your hand, pull your hand out, you put your thumb in the middle and put your fingers over the top. This is a pretty useful model of the brain. And the person's face will be here in front of your fingers, the top of the head here, the back of the head here. The middle prefrontal hair area is these middle 2 fingernails here. You've already heard about the parts of the brain, so I don't have to review them. But the bottom line is this area of the brain integrates the entire system. It takes in data from the body proper, from the brain stem, from the limbic area that you've heard about, from the cortex itself, and it pulls them all together and includes maps of other people's nervous systems. These you can call mind-sight maps. It makes a map of the internal world of someone else. So let me review these for you. These integrated functions include regulating the body, attuning to other people in communication, emotional balance, where life has meaning and is revved up enough so life is pleasurable and has vitality, but not too revved up where it's chaotic or too depleted where it's rigid. This harmonious flow between rigidity and chaos happens with integration. Integration has the feeling of harmony. You then have flexibility, where you can pause before you act, and this middle prefrontal area allows that to happen. Fear modulation means if you've been exposed to a traumatic event and feel terrified, this area actually grows fibers down to soothe the fear-generating amygdala, which is a part of your thumb area, the limbic area. Empathy is the capacity to imagine what it's like to be in another person's shoes, to make mind-sight maps of another person. So mind-sight includes empathy, and it also includes insight, the capacity to be present in the moment, connect where you're at now with the past, and imagine the future, something Endel Tolvin calls mental time travel, and that we can call insight. This area of the brain is also essential for morality, and you'll hear more about that tomorrow with Mark Hauser's presentation, but we know from various studies that damage to this area leads to amorality. And the production of morality seems to rely on the integrative circuits of this region. These 8 that I've just mentioned are outcomes, independent of the brain, of loving parent-child relationships. And the 9th one, intuition, just hasn't been studied yet. So what I want to suggest to you is that when you have relationships which honor the differences between us, but then encourage the linkage, that is defined as an integrative process. The linkage of differentiated parts is the definition of integration. This middle prefrontal area is one of the most integrative regions in the brain. And when we can grow these fibers, the mind becomes resilient and coherent, and relationships become loving, compassionate, and empathic. Integration, I want to suggest to you, is a definition of health. And there's a huge amount of research behind what I'm saying in this book called Mindsight and the Interpersonal Neurobiology series and all the different publications I've been a part of. What we look at is integration as a fundamental way to see how a nervous system can be healthy and resilient, a relationship between 2 people where differences are honored and then linkage is encouraged. That's a healthy relationship. Relationships within families, relationships within schools, even within nations, and perhaps even our global society. So integration becomes the link. So this triangle is not only a triangle of energy and information, but it can become a triangle of well-being, which looks like this. When the nervous system, the brain, is integrated, the mind becomes resilient and coherent, and our relationships become compassionate and empathic. This is a triangle of well-being where energy and information flow wherever you track it, even among neurons communicating with each other and linking different systems of the brain, which we do in these things we call domains of integration, or looking at societal processes and empowering people to use the mind, the process which regulates energy and information flow, how we define it, to move this whole system of the triangle toward integration. And when we do that, we come to realize that these bodily defined selves can be differentiated, but health comes from us linking to one another, not only now, but for all of the generations of people who will follow in what we do today. Thank you very much for your attention.